civil rights. We fought to end segregation, discrimination, and advance measures towards an integrated, diverse, multiracial society. And throughout our history, we have also had to confront the ugly legacy and backlash of bigotry, ignorance, and white nationalism. The arguments that protections and civil rights for historically marginalized populations as quote-unquote reverse racism or preferential is not new. We passed the Civil Rights Act and Economic Opportunity Act in 1964. The United States passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and spent decades afterwards integrating schools, all in an effort to build a society where people can work and be treated equally, no matter their race, gender, religion, or sexual orientation. But throughout it all, from Little Rock to Charlottesville to today, extremists have resisted these efforts to integrate American democracy. They weaponize fear and claim these efforts towards a better society are themselves unjust, unconstitutional, or illegal. Today's hearing is just the latest in a decades-long attack from right-wing extremists on any and all efforts to expand civil rights, equity, and freedom in the United States. Let's start with the Civil Rights Act, which is designed to ensure no person is discriminated against for something as simple as the color of their skin, their gender, or their religion. Before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was even passed, conservative anti-integrationists opposed it, arguing that the law would somehow violate their constitutional right to segregated spaces. But they lost that fight. And thanks to the landmark legislation of the 1960s, opportunities for Black Americans radically expanded. From 1959 to 1969, the poverty rate for Black Americans dropped nearly in half. The share of Black youth completing high school rose from 39% to 56%, and the gap between white and Black incomes reached the lowest it had ever been, all after integrationist pro-civil rights policies were passed. Then came the conservative response afterwards. In the late 60s, Republican President Richard Nixon, determined to gain support from Southern white politicians by appealing to racism, promised to slow civil rights enforcement. In the 1970s, right-wing opponents of civil rights and integration started framing efforts to ensure all Americans have equal access to opportunities as quote-unquote reverse racism. And in the 1980s, Republicans and right-wing judges, including now Chief Justice John Roberts, built on that framing to advance a dubious argument. If we don't talk about bigotry, it doesn't exist. So instead of punishing bigoted leaders and organizations and societal structures in violation of the law, and working to create a more equitable world, the law would instead pretend race and racism and their real-world impacts didn't exist. This right-wing legal effort continues today. One lawyer alone, Edward Blum, backed by wealthy right-wingers, has brought more than 24 cases since the 1990s attempting to remove consideration of race entirely from key civil rights laws. This resistance to integration in every part of society, whether it be in schools or housing or the workforce, is an attempt to destroy the progress we have made toward a more equal and just society. But it's also an economic play, and that's what's important for people to understand. This is a way to keep the status quo that gives a handful of the most wealthy people in our society power and immunity, and distract the working class from attaining the basic rights and protections we all deserve. These right-wing billionaires prey on racism, bigotry, anti-trans panic, and fear to drive wedges in our communities and prevent resources from going to public services that predominantly serve working class communities. They use these arguments to defund our schools, to defund our communities, and to defund our public infrastructure. They divide us and they dismantle our public housing, and they union bust. And let's be clear, these extremists are not just destroying the public institutions that working people rely upon as retaliation in some culture war. No, defunding services for working people is the point. And we've seen what happens when they pursue this goal. Last year alone, more than 4,200 books were targeted in right-wing attempts for censorship. Most often targeted for censorship were those books that cover themes related to race, gender, and sexual orientation. Last year, a record 510 anti-LGBTQ bills were introduced in state legislatures. And since the Dobbs decision 2 years ago this week, 21 states now ban abortion or are more restrictive than the standard was in place under Roe. Those opposed to integration see all of this as a victory, and they are not planning to stop there. Project 2025, the radical right-wing playbook detailing conservative Donald Trump's agenda for a second term, devotes an entire chapter to detailing the many ways that the federal government should roll back progress and turn back the clock on civil rights and liberties in the first place. I will note that the majority of this committee has apparently invited the author of that chapter to testify here today. This hearing is fundamentally an insult to the promise of a multiracial democracy that we all represent and require for prosperity for a working-class America. This hearing is fundamentally an insult to all of us. My Republican colleagues are going to say empty words about discrimination in the workplace today. They're going to play on fear and provide yet another opportunity for radical right-wing extremism, the kind that says if you're not white or cisgender or straight or a man, you don't deserve equal rights, protections over your own body, and the ability to have control over your own life to take root. But we're not going to fall for it, and we're not going to let them get away with it. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Today we are joined by the Honorable Todd Rokita, who serves as the Chief Legal Officer of the state of Indiana as their Attorney General. He previously served Indiana's 4th